Welcome to our Habitat for Humanity home maintenance class. My name is Paul Gusty, and I'm a volunteer instructor with Habitat for Humanity. I always like to start these classes with a disclaimer. I am not a professional carpenter or a plumber or an electrician or a professional painter. I am, in fact, just like you. I am a homeowner. And I have maybe gotten a little bit more experience than you have at this point in your stage of home ownership because I've owned several houses and I've gained some experience working on them over the years. So I would like to share with you today what I've learned, and maybe you will take that and become more confident about tackling some of the projects that will come up in your house. So with that said, let's get started. How to repair any damage that you might incur in your drywall. And we're going to cover things like a popped nail that might pop out of the drywall, or a screw that might work its way through the drywall, how to repair any kind of a small, like a round hole that's not too big, maybe 2 inches or less in diameter. We're going to teach you how to repair that. And in case you have a bigger problem, a bigger hole, we'll give you a different technique to work on that. So here's the tools that you would need to do all of the things that I just talked about. You would need, let's just start with the mesh tape, and you can just pull it off and you can see that it's literally mesh tape, and it has adhesive on this side, and that's what you're going to apply to the wallboard. And then you mix what I call mud or joint compound into the mesh, and it'll dry, and it'll kind of like replace your damaged wallboard. And so that said, here's a bucket of, I call it mud, but it's drywall joint compound. And you can get smaller containers of this. You also can get larger containers, but you can probably get a pint or a quart size of this joint compound. And that's nice and goopy, and you'll see that when we start to do the projects. And then to spread this mud, you have a putty knife. And these come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes, and this is kind of an average size, a Goldilocks size, if you will. And then once that wallboard dries, we're going to sand it down with a sanding block. I kind of like these. They're sponge blocks, actually, with sandpaper on them. They're easy to hold, and you can get them in different grits. For wallboard, I like to use a very fine grit. It's a 220 grit. Okay, and then I forgot scissors. You have to cut the mesh tape, and you use scissors to do that. And moving on to our pop nail, which we're going to cover in a second, there's one way of solving a pop nail, and I'll show you that. It's pounding the nail right back into the wall, even deeper than it was. And then another way, if you don't want to do that, you can get a nail set and use a hammer and pound that way and drive a nail back into the wall. You do less damage to the drywall that way. So either way works. Either way, we're going to fix the drywall before we walk away. And then we're going to need a drywall screw. And let's see. And then, of course, a drywall screw, you need a screw gun with a Phillips screw head. And then for the larger repairs that we're going to show you, we're still going to use the mesh tape and the mud and the putty knife and the sanding block. But we're going to need to actually cut out some wallboard. So you need to find a scrap piece of probably 1/2 inch wallboard. That's probably the size of wallboard that you have in your home. So you have to make sure it's the same thickness. And so just find a piece of scrap. So this is probably way too big. For our demos, it's way too big. So we're going to have to cut it down to size that we need. And there's 2 ways to cut it down. One is a utility knife. And you can open up the blade like that. And then I recommend that you replace your utility blade, get a fresh blade, because it'll take a really sharp blade to cut through the wallboard. And then another way to cut wallboard is a drywall saw. It's just a little, an 8-inch blade with a kind of a rough saw blade. Nice easy handle, and it just goes right through the wallboard like that. Okay? And then lastly, another scrap item that you maybe can find at a construction site. It's just any kind of like a 1x3, maybe 1x4 piece of wood. The length, it depends on how big a hole you have in your wall. So this is just a sample of what it would look like. And we'll show you how to use that as well. And with that introduction to all the tools that you might need, we're going to step back and do a popped nail. We have now set up here a small demonstration of a piece of wallboard. You can see that I've used this in the classes that we teach, and there's some people have already been practicing. I've tried to set up some demos of a popped nail and kind of a screw that's kind of come loose from the wallboard. So there's two ways of solving a popped nail. One is with a nail set and a hammer, and you could drive that thing right back into the wood. The other way of doing it, and because this nail has a fairly large head and the nail set is very, very thin, I'm going to take the other approach and create what's called a dimple. And I'm just going to pound this into the wall so that it's recessed. It's no longer on the surface of the wall. Now, it looks like I just damaged the wall even worse, and I guess I did. But with our mud, I can take just a little dab of mud and squeeze that in there, like so. And then you let that dry, and you can either prime it or paint it, or both. If your house was attached with screws, here again, your house is shifting, earthquakes, wind, whatever it is, it could cause, a screw is not going to come out of the wood typically. It's in there pretty tight because of the threads of the screw. But the frame could shift, and the wallboard could actually come out a little bit away from the wood, but the screw isn't going to come out away from the wood, so you're going to end up seeing the screw recessed. So you've got like a screw-sized hole in your wall. And again, there's not enough wallboard there for it to really secure the wallboard to the stud. So we're going to first repair the damage, and then, like I said, I'm going to put that screw in right here, and that will secure the wallboard to the stud. So this one will be even easier because I don't have much damage. It's just a hole. Squeeze that mud in there, just like that. When that dries, you could come along and use the sponge sand block and then sand it smooth. And same with the nail pop. That looks like it's already pretty smooth, but you can still sand it. And then you, of course, have to paint it. So the last step to either one of these steps, right, is to replace the holding power that we lost with either one of those with new holding power in the form of a screw. And I prefer screws to pounding in a nail. But then pounding in a nail would work too, but I think the screw is better. So it's as simple as this. And you want to bury that. You want to make sure that the screw is a little bit into the drywall. And then you're going to take your mud and you're going to fill that hole. Simple as that. Well, that's a dimple there. And you can, if when it dries, if you're not happy with the smoothness of it, just put another coat of mud on it. That's okay. And in the final end, you're going to sand it with the sanding block and then paint it. So that's all there is to the nail pop and the screw coming loose. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a hole in your wallboard. Who knows how that hole got there? So we're going to fix it. It's not going to be difficult. Wallboard is nothing more than a fairly thick paper surface filled with a 1/2 inch of gypsum, which is that mineral we talked about. And then on the other side is just more paper. So that's all it is. But it has a lot of strength. So we're going to take this loose stuff off of here. So you want to make it at the edge as clean as you can get it. I'm just peeling off the surface of it. Okay, so that's pretty decent. So the first thing we do is we take our mesh tape that we showed you earlier, and we're going to cover the hole with the mesh tape. Now it's adhesive on the back, and so you really want to put a piece. I'm going to split the hole in half basically, because you want to have at least an inch, maybe even an inch and a half of mesh on the actual wallboard. So in this case, I'm going to do that. So I have like an inch or so above the hole and an inch below, and I'll use my scissors and I'll cut this off and just kind of work that in so that the adhesive can do its job holding to the wallboard. And I'm going to put another piece right here. In fact, let me see if I can cut it before I... Okay, do another piece here. And you don't want to ever overlap the mesh tape, because then you're adding thickness. Because your ultimate goal, when you're going to put mud on here, of course, your ultimate goal is to have the mud so close to the surface of the wallboard that you don't notice that there's actually a raise in the wall, because it's going to be very tapered off and it's going to be very gradual, and you really won't notice it when we're done. But if you put 2 layers of tape on, of mesh tape, that makes it more thick, and it makes it more difficult to taper it off and make it look like it's a smooth wall. So we've got the tape all in here tight, and we're going to get our mud out, and we're going to fill that hole, and we're going to fill that hole with as much mud as we can get in there. So I'm going to get a fair amount of mud on this and just start very gradually. And I'm not pushing. I don't want to push because I don't want to disturb the mesh. You can see the mesh flexing. It's going inwards as I'm pushing. And I don't want to disturb that mesh, but I do need to get the mud in the hole, because this mud is replacing the gypsum. And it's never going to be as good as the original wallboard, because we're never going to get that full ½ inch thickness of gypsum in there. But we're going to get as much as we can. And I'm also going to move the putty knife upwards. I'm going to move it in all different directions to hopefully get the mud to attach to the edges of the hole that are behind the wallboard here. So if I go up like this, I might be able to get some to grip onto that upper surface. And I think I already did that side. Let me try this side. And again, it does no harm to put a whole bunch. I always tell my class, just because they always get timid about putting too much mud on, I say, put more mud, because you can do no wrong by putting more mud in there. If you put too much mud in there, what's it going to do? It's going to drop on the inside of your wall to the bottom of where the floor is, I guess. It doesn't do any harm. You'll never see it. So why not try to get as much mud in there as you can while still keeping the mesh tape in place. Now I'm going to put some mud around the outside as well, because I want the entire mesh and more covered with mud. So we're going to make this a little wider than the actual hole, because we're going to need that to taper it, because at the edges it's going to taper down to the surface of the wallboard, and at the middle here it's got to be thick enough to cover the mesh tape. Now you'll notice that it's not covering the mesh tape. Oops, and that's okay. And you can keep doing this. You can do this for a half hour if you want, because the mud will stay workable for a long time. So I'm just going to stop at some point here. This process takes maybe 3 iterations before it gets as smooth as the wall. So we're going to show you what those other iterations look like. But this is a good first step. And this mud is going to take at least 24 hours to dry, depending on the temperature. It might even take 2 days to dry. So we're going to leave it alone, let it dry, and then we're going to come back and I'll show you what we do in the next step after this dries. Okay, now we've set up another demo wallboard module that's similar to what we just did. We're going to pick up where we left off. The other one is literally drying right now, and we don't want to wait for it to dry, so we've taken one that was in that same stage, and I'm going to show you the next step to get this to a point where it's a smooth finish on the wall. So you start out with, you probably will look and see how it is looking here. And obviously we have to cover the mesh tape, which is showing through, but you can feel it, it's pretty solid here. And that's the wall that you just created. And then this kind of rough on the edges here. And you can even see the tape all the way through. So it needs another coat. So I'm going to take the sanding block and smooth out the edges here, the little rough spots, and lightly go over the middle section where you can see the mesh, and just kind of smooth it out. And then it'll be ready for a second coat of mud. So let me do that here. And I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so now we're going to add another layer of mud. We've kind of taken the rough edges off, and we're just going to add more mud as our second step. We don't need a lot of mud, but clearly we have to get rid of the mesh tape that's showing through. And there's also a little dimple, a break in the paper surface that we didn't have on our original, but we'll fix that too. And we're just going to put that, going to put this on again. It can be heavy, knowing that we're going to come back and sand it again. If we do it right, we won't have to apply more mud. Okay, so I think this looks good, and we can let this dry, and then we're going to show you the finished product, what it would look like after this dried and it got sanded down smooth. Okay, now we have a new demo wallboard set up for you, and this is showing the final product. This is the end of the third step. And as you can see, here's our repair, and it's perfectly smooth. You note that you cannot see any of the mesh tape fibers at all, and the edges are smooth. It looks like there might be some mud here, but it's imperceptible between the wallboard and the repair mud. So it's just perfectly smooth, and this is how you want it to look when you're done. And it's not that hard to do. So you can do these 3 steps and repair your walls. At this point, you would probably maybe want to put a primer on here, and then your coat of paint that matches your wall color. And that would be all you need to do. And now we're going to move on and show you the large hole repairs. Okay, now that we've shown you how to repair a small hole, what happens if you get a larger hole? That technique that we talked about is probably not going to work for a larger hole. This mesh tape is just not going to have the strength to sustain a larger hole like we have here. So let's show you a different technique that works pretty well, and it's easily doable on a larger hole. It's a little intimidating at first, but I think you could do it. Okay, so we have a large hole. So the first thing that we did is I found a scrap piece of drywall, and I sized it already before we started to make sure that it covered the hole that we have. So it's a little bit bigger, so it covers it just fine. And so what I'm going to do is trace the outline of this replacement piece, just so. It doesn't have to be square. The squarer the better, I guess, but this is kind of wonky. That's okay. And I'm going to do that, trace it this way. Come along and trace it this way and trace it this way. So you have an outline of the hole. Okay. Now, maybe counterintuitively, we're going to make the hole bigger. I've opened up enough hole to get this drywall saw through. All right, well, that's crumpled out of there. So let's just keep going then. Okay. Bring it out a little bit. Now, let's see if we did it right. Will this fit? So it fits. You just really wanted to test. You don't want it to drop through the wall because now you have to cut another piece. So this fits. And so now we're ready for the next step. So something has to hold it up. Something has to keep it solid. So that can be solved with a couple of pieces of wood. And we're going to put these wood. I can reach through the hole because there is a hole in the wall. Let me get rid of that. So I'm going to do this, and I'm just going to tell you first what I'm doing. I've got this piece of wood, and I'm going to put some drywall screws through here and into this spare piece of wood, which I happen to find around. And so here's some drywall screws. Let me start out let me start right up here. So I get it started, and then now I can reach through and hold it. So you want half of the wood behind the wallboard and the other half sticking out because it's going to hold up our replacement piece. All right, so here we go. And this takes a little bit of pressure. I'm squeezing the wood to the wallboard so that I can get the screw into the wood. You can see it wiggling a little bit, but there you go, we're in the wood. All right, let's do one down here. I'm going to back it over. There we go, and then you want to drive the wallboard screws so that they're flush. Or a little dimpled in, but no further than that. All right, and then actually, we should probably do another screw. Just put three, and just hold this size. I think 3 screws. All right, that's good. And you notice I was fearful that I didn't have enough wood behind the wallboard here, so I drilled that screw a little bit on an angle to make sure I hit the wood. All right, now let's do the other side. So let me do a pilot hole here first. Okay, and I'm going to put this back through here. Split, half of the wood is behind the wallboard, half of the wood is in the hole. And I want to make sure I have enough wood there. Okay, I'm going to reach up closer to the. You don't want to make sure you're squeezing right behind the screw because then you're going to put a screw through your finger. So make sure your finger is below where that screw is. There we go. And it's the first one that's the hardest. So let's get the next one. You might as well start the second one with the right hand too. Get it ready to go. All right, now, left-handed, finger below the screw. And I got that a little heavy, but that's okay. It's still going to support it just fine. And okay, so now you've got a foundation that is going to hold and support your replacement piece. Okay, now that we've got all the screws in, this is what it looks like. You've got the wood behind each of the seams here and with screws holding the wood together. What you didn't see is we went ahead and drilled the screws into the replacement piece of wallboard and then through to the wood that you saw exposed from the back. So now the whole thing is in pretty solid, and we are going to take our mesh tape that we used in the small hole. And just like we did before in the small hole, just a little bit bigger piece, we're going to take about an inch above the gap, inch or so above the gap, and then we're going to cover that seam with the mesh tape, and we're going to cut it off down here. So now you've got the mesh, just like we did before, and then I'll do another one over here. Cut about to that size. And we're going to hold that in place. And now we're going to do cross pieces with the mesh. And we don't want to overlap the mesh, so let's see if I can, and we're going to cover the seam. So let's just cut it right here. Okay. And remove it, reposition it. Right to here is good. Rub it in there so it adheres. Okay, now we're going to put this last piece on the seam. And again, not overlapping the mesh tape, because again, we don't want to build up material on top of the surface of the wall, because when we're done with the repair, we want the mud that we're going to put on here to look as if it were just the flat surface of the wall, but it truly will be stuck out a little bit like we've talked before. So you don't want to overlap the mesh because that's double thickness, all right? And then now we're ready to go. We've got some mud here. This is the same mud that we used before. And it's a simple matter of taking a healthy amount of mud, and we're going to just force it in, just lightly though, like we did before, just very gently, but forcing the mud into that crevice. And the more mud you get in there, the stronger your repair will be. So let's just go all the way around. And you also are going to, well, we're going to cover the whole, all the mesh, but right now I'm concentrating on the seam, the open seam. And you can spread it this way, and come along and spread it that way. In different directions will help push more mud in there and get the mud, because you really want the mud to hit both sides, both pieces of drywall that we're trying to join. Okay, now let's do the top. I'm going to start like that, just forcing that in. This part is pretty much the same as the small hole, it's just a bigger area. And instead of a hole, you've got a seam. And I'm not pushing really hard. It's just because I don't want to disturb the mesh tape. It needs to stay in place. And I think I'm almost going to call that good. Okay, and now it's a simple matter of getting more mud on to cover the entire area. And this, like the small holes, this is going to be a multi-step process. So the first step is just smoothing the mud on to cover it. And we'll have to let that dry. And it doesn't matter if I get mud out here, that's okay. We'll get rid of it. And there's no need to go for the final look here, because we're probably going to do this at least 3 times. We're going to let it dry. We're going to sand it. We're going to reapply mud. And as the mud dries, just like before, the mud will shrink a little bit. So it's not really going to look the same when it dries. As you get to the finishing touch, just go a little lighter. And again, it doesn't matter that the mesh still shows through a little bit because this is the first application. For the first go-round, I think that's fine. Okay, so hopefully this was very useful to you in terms of learning how to repair holes in your wall, large and small. Process is about the same as you saw, and hopefully you won't have to do this. But if you do, you know how. And that concludes our home maintenance course today. Thank you for spending your valuable time with me, and I hope you took away some useful lessons. And remember, if you're taking this course for credit, please take the test at the end of the course.